The world is on a knife edge. There's over 100 armed conflicts currently taking place right across the globe. Some of these are new, others have been going on for decades. But each episode will break down everything you need to know to understand the battles shaping the world today. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Maddie, Hale. This week, we are going straight back into the Israel-Hamas war as the conflict has severely escalated in the last few days. The tensions between the Jewish state and Palestine have run deep for decades, but it all intensified on October 7 last year when terrorist group Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel, killing over 1,500 Israelis and kidnapping 250. Today, Israel and Hamas are still locked in a deadly war. As the IDF and Israeli government seem to be stopping at nothing to kill every single member of Hamas, it has tragically resulted in the deaths of over 32,000 Palestinians. On Sunday, an Israeli strike intended to kill Hamas leaders also hit a tent camp full of Palestinians in the southern Gazan city of Rafah, killing at least 45 people and injuring many more. Joining me now to discuss all the latest in this ongoing battle is Rear Admiral and former NATO Commander Chris Perry. Chris, thank you so much for your time today. The scenes coming out of the Rafah camp are harrowing. Civilians being burnt alive in melting tents in an effort to kill those two senior Hamas commanders. It kind of seems right now Israel will be doing everything in its power, choosing to face the consequences later in order to kill every member of Hamas. Do you think that's correct?
Well, I think the whole incident is subject to inquiry at the moment, and there are some fairly disturbing details coming out, obviously, about the effects of what happened. As far as I can see, the attack on the two Hamas officials, those who are supporting operations in the West Bank, I think it was Yassin Rabia and Khaled Najjar, were the ones killed. They were fairly small munitions. There's a lot of talk of 2,000-pound bombs. That's ridiculous, because if there had been 2,000-pound bombs, you'd have seen massive craters the size of the tented area. In fact, I think the Israelis are using their specialist 36-millimeter bombs, which are designed to minimize damage. What I'm seeing on the ground from people in Gaza are saying, well, actually, in the middle of that tented enclosure, there was Hamas ammunition and fuel stocks and things like that. There's also some confusion, I think, on the Palestinian side as to what was a safe area and what wasn't. I'm afraid to say this is all part of what happens when you mix up civilians with combatants, and with Hamas hiding amongst the people and storing their munitions and fuel there. And I think also some rockets that they were firing at Israel. I'm afraid these tragedies are inevitable, if regrettable.
How significant for Israel were those two deaths, those two Hamas leaders? Is there any word on how big of a part of the organisation of Hamas they were?
Well, I think we have to realise that the Israelis got 3 brigades operating in Gaza right now. In the south, they're sweeping round to cut off Rafah from the Egyptian border, the tunnels and the surface connections they've got there. And as part of that, they're taking out basically Hamas officials and commanders and operators when they get intelligence that leads to that. On this occasion, these two Hamas officials are ones who are used to coordinating the militia groups and sabotage in the West Bank. So obviously the Israelis are keeping their eye on that. They're also keeping another eye on what's happening in the north, of course, because Hezbollah is continuing to fire rockets into northern Israel, and they've threatened to devastate the border region there. And I think, Maddie, you and I both know the Israelis have had to evacuate the northern region on the border with Lebanon because of that.
Chris, Israel are using their intelligence to track and locate these Hamas leaders, as you and I have spoken about. They're hiding in plain sight, hiding with civilians. They know exactly what they're doing. But is there any word on how many Hamas leaders Israel actually has left to kill in order to kind of stop the fighting and enter a ceasefire?
I think the real problem, Maddie, is that as soon as the Israelis clear an area and let civilians go back into those areas, you get re-infiltration by Hamas. If you look at the north, which has been cleared, of course, by Israel, I think up to 3 so-called battalions of Hamas have re-infiltrated. I think the Israelis have destroyed one of them, and there's probably 2 still on the ground. So I think I've heard recently an Israeli general say it's like the task of Sisyphus here. You're rolling something uphill, and as soon as you get it to the top, it rolls back down again. So the Israelis are having to cope not only with clearance operations in the south, but also trying to deal with re-infiltration in the center and in the north as well. And with 3 brigades, that's a pretty tough task.
So there's no real number on how many members of Hamas still operating. Obviously, we know that there was a lot hiding in tunnels and then a lot hiding in plain sight. Do we know how many Hamas members or even smaller followers are still left? Or is that kind of something that's not public knowledge?
Well, we don't know because there's a lot of disinformation, Maddie, as you well know, and people who carry a rifle or a grenade launcher for Hamas by day go home to their families at night. And so just as in Afghanistan, it's very difficult to tell who the fighters are except when they're on the ground, which is why, again, if you fight amongst the people, you know that you're going to encourage civilian casualties. Hamas know this. They're constantly saying how they wish to sacrifice their people so that Hamas survives. I'm amazed that the Gazans put up with it.
Do you think the IDF was aware and just kind of ran the risk that shooting in this area, this refugee camp, would result in the deaths of so many civilians?
Maddie, I don't think the Israelis targeted this camp at all. If you look at the sectors that are on the maps, the area of the tented camp is actually a safe area. The area attacked by Israel is designated not a safe area, one where they would use munitions. I think what complicated it is that you had a secondary effect from the ammunition, fuel, and rockets that were stored in that humanitarian area by Hamas, and they ignited. And I'm afraid to say that if you are careless, or indeed you have them too close to even small munitions, they're going to cook off. And if you look at the damage, it's quite clear that's a fuel fire. That's not caused by explosions at all. And as I said, if the bombs that have been claimed have been used by the Israelis, the 2,000-pounders, you'd be seeing massive craters, and they're not there.
We spoke about this before, but 1 million people, Chris, had evacuated the area of Rafah as the Israeli government had warned to leave. And this was meant to be a safe space for over 1.5 to 7 million Palestinians. When the Palestinians fled the area knowing that Israel was targeting Rafah, they're moving into newer safe spaces. Is it safe to say that Hamas will just continue to move in whatever safe space is then made to be for the innocent refugees, and then there's nowhere else to go?
Yeah, I'm afraid that the Gazan population is the sea in which Hamas swims. And unless the Israelis drain that particular sea, then you're not going to get rid of Hamas. As I said, you've got the hardcore Hamas operators, the commanders and the permanent employees, if you like. But quite a lot of people in Gaza are carrying weapons for Hamas, either because they want to or they're being forced to. So it's incredibly difficult. We know that. So unless you can control the population and the utilities and what's happening on the ground, it's very difficult indeed to separate these people out.
Benjamin Netanyahu said that what happened was a tragic mistake, and he obviously doesn't wish these deaths would have happened in this area. But do you think that the IDF will continue to carry out similar attacks that do result in these, tragic casualties of Palestinians?
The IDF is going to continue what it has to do to complete its operations and deliver objectives in Gaza. I think we've seen they are trying to take care to avoid civilian casualties, but I'm afraid it's the character of what is going on in Gaza that will determine how many casualties there are. At the end of the day, the quickest way to end a war is for one side to lose it. And the sooner that Hamas lose this war, then the less casualties we're going to have. And the Israelis, are trying to be careful. But I don't know any army or armed forces in the world that could actually do this with less casualties if you're trying to cleanse Gaza of these terrorists.
It does obviously seem that the IDF have their hands tied if they've got Hamas terrorists hiding amongst civilians. They know exactly what they're doing, as I said. But this is a situation, Chris, where it's obviously going to keep happening until a ceasefire is called, how likely do you think both parties would come together and say, okay, enough is enough?
I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Israelis are quite close to completing this campaign. I'll be very surprised if it lasts more than 2 months now. The very fact that we're getting casualties in amongst the population is an indication to me that Hamas are getting quite desperate as to where they're hiding. And I think we'll see more and more targeted strikes by Israel in the next couple of weeks. And I anticipate, with tanks in the middle of all the major urban areas of Gaza, that this operation will be over, as I said, in about 2 months.
What do you make of reports and commentary that Israel has committed war crimes and ignored international law?
Well, as with all these things, you have to see the evidence. In the fog of war, accidents happen, people make mistakes, their judgment, of course, is called into question. We don't know the facts. And in an area which is absolutely characterized by disinformation, propaganda, and misinformation, we can't tell. I am confident that in an operation of this intensity and complexity, there will have been a lot of mistakes on both sides. But we do know that one side, Hamas, is trying to generate as many casualties on the Palestinian side as possible to show to the world, apparently, how bad the Israelis are. The Israelis are trying to minimize casualties, but I'm afraid in this sort of campaign, it's impossible to avoid civilian casualties. And as I said, I don't know any armed force in the world that could actually do this operation and not get tripped up occasionally.
Well, on that note, the global conversation does seem to have shifted in the last month, whether it be from protests or just more coverage where there's this global pressure for Israel to halt all its military offences, which they've obviously ignored. But do you think that this global pressure from the United States, Israel's biggest funder, you've got Italy saying that, this is unjustifiable, the UN, big parties saying that they must stop. Do you think that Hamas or Israel will ever give in just because of the international pressure?
No, I don't. And unless people can come to Israel and say, look, here's a really good plan to get your hostages released, to get justice for the victims of 7th of October, and to create a situation that gives peace and stability and security to the people of that region, the Israelis will say, look, we've got the only plan in town at the moment, and we're going to continue implementing that plan until we achieve our objectives. So I'm afraid to say that people, bleating about having a ceasefire, that's no solution at all. It's no solution for the Israelis, and it certainly won't get Gaza back on its feet again and reconstruction started. I'm afraid it's a very ignorant person that calls for a ceasefire and then expects things to happen afterwards for which they haven't planned.
Chris, just finally, with someone of your background, you've said just before that you think that this will take 2 months to finish off. How do you see the next 2 months actually playing out?
Well, the Israelis will continue to conduct targeted strikes against any pockets of Hamas resistance or military capability in Gaza. And they'll continue till they complete it. I don't think that Hamas will be able to move with quite the same sort of facility if their tunnel network has been neutralized. They'll be exposed on the ground, and if they put any military capability out there, the Israelis will destroy it.
So you think that Israel will win this fight once and for all? Absolutely.
They have to win it because they're involved in an existential crisis right now. If they fail in Gaza, it will encourage Israel's enemies elsewhere, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen, Syria, or indeed Hezbollah in Iran.
Chris Perry, thank you so much for your time today.